Book 3. The Council of the Ages. Chapter 5. Elf prisons have an advantage with respect to any other of Shanary's. They are very bright, beautiful and clean. The stay in them is very bearable, but they are among the most complicated to achieve a successful escape. Shanary's prisons. Author, Kairam Darzin. At Arian's request, the priestess was led early in the morning into the palace's dungeons that were located deep underground. What were dark dungeons to the elves in many places in Shanary's would be considered palace-like and well-lit rooms. They dropped a lot, until they reached a kind of interior well where the jailers stood guard. Who joined the Arian entrance? The priestess was not alone, she was escorted by 2 knights of Elen. One of the knights who was escorting her ordered the jailers to open the door of one of the galleries, and there were the 2 contenders, locked in 2 adjoining cells. The elf was lying on the bed in Agnoruk in a slightly stranger position, had her back flat on the floor and her legs placed on the bed. It didn't seem like the past night was very pleasant for the half-orc. They opened the door of the cell. Arian entered with certain reservations. No matter how elegant it was the first time he had been inside a cell. The priestess smiled at the sight of Agnoruk lying down in that strange way. The half-orc did not stand up to greet the visitor. "Wow, it seems to hurt." "It only hurts when I go to pee." Arian shook his head upon hearing the half-orc's comment. "Come on, let me see." Agnoruk was so in pain that he did not protest Arian's request, and obediently as he could and very slowly pulled down his pants. Arian knelt down to examine the wound. He found the central area of his crotch very swollen and purple. It was a very good blow from the elf. You could tell that he had practice. Arian requested a jug of water and a bowl from the jailers, who quickly complied with the priestess's request. He took the jewel from his neck, placed it inside the bowl, and then poured water from the jug until the bowl was full. Once this action was complete, Arian closed his eyes to recite a prayer. "O Elaban, help me so that this poor wretch may be healed of his wounds." "Poor wretch?" Agnoruk murmured. "Shut up." The priestess corrected the half-orc. The jewel shone for a few moments in the water, and without removing it, Arian poured the liquid over the half-orc's crotch. Agnoruk felt a kind of strange stinging as he felt the water in his wound. Within seconds the swelling and pain was completely gone. Agnoruk no longer had any discomfort. The half-orc quickly pulled up his pants, wetting them. It looked like he had on himself. "You should be very careful." The order was, "Don't fight with anyone during our stay at the council. Debok is going to punish you on our return." But it was the elf and the Denkga. Enough is enough. Arian was sick of excuses. The 2 turned to look at the elf, who was totally dumbfounded. She had contemplated the miraculous healing of the half-orc. Arian's fame was not widespread among the elves, except among some members of the court. The adventures and achievements of the priestess had gone completely unnoticed in Borderlania, so for Paulanna it was a surprise to see someone with that healing ability. Arian noticed the surprised elf. Her cheekbone was completely swollen. And thanks to his talent for healing, Arian suspected that he was suffering from a broken bone. He left Agnoruk in his cell to go to where Paulanna was. They opened the cell for her, so Arian could examine the elf's face, and although Paulanna did not complain, she did indeed have a broken cheekbone. He repeated the ritual. He refilled the bowl with water, then the jewel shone back into the water. "Elaban comes to the aid of this humble servant of yours, and please heal the wounds of this poor elf." Paulanna, when she noticed that the water touched her face, she felt something similar to a kind of electric shock, and then her face no longer hurt. The inflammation disappeared completely. Arian didn't speak to them anymore and quickly left the dungeon. He had just enough time. The council meeting was about to begin. The first meeting was held in the Library of Wisdom, a building where the oldest and most important books of the elves of this kingdom were kept. It had incunabula from the first era, but none were written by the gods. Those copies were lost in the course of the Elven and Orc Wars, when the previous library was burned in its entirety. A terrible misfortune. The current building was a construction that had the typical architecture of Borderlandia, a building with large windows and a huge dome. In the central part of the dome there was a glass from where you could see the blue sky. The building was oriented so that the window of the main nave had a complete panoramic view of the waterfall of creation. The library had been prepared to receive the members of the council. The shelves of the nave had disappeared to place two huge semicircular tables and then a series of chairs. Between the two tables was a small table and a huge board with a large map of a region that Arian didn't know. The young woman took a seat at the main table where all the kings summoned to the council were seated. Although her position was the most lateral within the table, it was an honor to be seated there. Since in the center of the table sat the great king of the elves of Borderlandia, beside him on the right the other two elven kings, and then on the far right of the table were the dwarven kings. On the left of the great king were the human kings and Arian next to the latter, occupying the outermost place of the table. The other exception at the table next to Arian was the gabbler who was seated in the central part, right next to the great elf king, which indicated the importance of her figure, the representative of Thysis. Although she lacked royal blood, she was so powerful that the kings allowed her to share their table during the council. At the central table sat the mags of the council, commanded by Ferdinand. They were surrounded by hundreds of books and scrolls stacked in a disorderly way that they went through non-stop. On the other large semicircular table were placed all those emissaries who were not kings but who had come to the council as a representation of their nations. For example, there was a representative of the Black Empire, a consul of the Republic of Caesarea, Anora as a representative of the dwarfs of the hills, or the Princess Nesmarina on the part of Demember. Behind this table, Arian watched the last members of the council sit on chairs at the back of the room. In these chairs were the guests who were not members of the council but whose presence was totally justified. There were Aris, Kush and Gosberg. But Tanya and Vanis, the orcs, Kritas, or Sabu were not invited, and so few were eager to come. They began with the usual formalities. The Grand Chamberlain began to list the titles of all the monarchs summoned at the council. Arian got bored with so much formalism and his gaze was focused on the outside. The day was beautiful and through the windows, although from his position he could not contemplate the waterfall, only the real stables. He was surprised to see that next to a huge mountain of excrement were two individuals carrying the excrement inside a cart using only their hands. Arian smiled as he saw that the two individuals were Agnoruk and the elf. Surely it was the punishment they had to serve after the fight during yesterday's dinner. The half-orc seemed to wear it better than the elf. Arian was so attentive to the couple that she was completely distracted by what was happening inside the library, so when the chamberlain named the great priestess of the god Elaban, Arian didn't realize they were referring to her. They had to tap him on the shoulder to get him to focus again. The high priestess stood up a little, blushing from the gaff, and bowed slightly to everyone present. Meanwhile outside, the punished continued to load the excrement in the cart, since it was a fertilizer highly appreciated by the peasants who supplied food to the royal palace. Agnoruk was happy, healed of his wounds and enjoyed the outdoors. For Paulanna it was a great dishonor that an elf knight had to pick up excrement with her hands. Although the punishment was simple for the time being, they had to fill 3 wagons with excrement and then they could return to their rooms. Although Prince Enrich surely had a greater punishment prepared for her, she was full of rage. All because of you, filthy orc. Paulanna threw a piece of excrement at Agnoruk's head, who received the blow stoically. There were 2 guards watching that they served their sentences, and spending a night in the dungeons of the Palace of the Heavens would reach the half-orc. He decided to ignore the elf and continue with his transfer of excrement. Then he planned to spend all the time inside his room waiting for the return to Almera. He was saturated with the elves and their. He paused for a moment to take a deep breath and saw that Paulanna's work was quite poor. She barely carried excrement in the car and in a slow way. You should hurry up to fill the car with shit, so we'll get out of this place first. Paulanna looked at the half-orc with hatred and threw a piece of dung at the cart with disdain. That's for you, Anaskel. I will have a much greater punishment. I have disobeyed an order from the king. The half-orc wanted to end the punishment as soon as possible. He took a large piece of excrement to hurry, but the piece fell apart in his hands. The half-orc stained his entire uniform with dung and only had this garment. It would smell like shit for weeks. He got a little angry. Not having started the fight, idiot. Agnoruk snapped at the elf. Paulanna flared up again at the half-orc's words and threw a piece of excrement at the wagon in a violent manner. Next time it will go to you, man. To disobey your king's order again, I don't see that you are very intelligent. Look. I was already a warrior when your grandparents' grandparents only crawled. Well, wow. You don't notice much experience, you look like a rookie. Joked the half-orc. Paulanna sighed. What she lacked, now she had to put up with the disrespect of a simple monstrosity. He stopped carrying shit to face Agnoruk. You're an Anaskel. You would deserve to die just for the fact of stepping on this earth. We have been invited. I am as unhappy to be here as you are, Darbakars. In the course of the argument the two gradually approached until they almost came to blows again. However, the fight did not escalate as they both saw how some elven knights approached their position. The entourage was led by Prince Inrich, who was very smiling. Paulanna squared herself since he was her superior. The prince and the knights who accompanied him seemed to enjoy the moment. They had been waiting for this for a long time. Paulanna, you have again disobeyed an order of mine. The elf tried to keep her composure, but she wasn't going to stay silent. They are a Nazgul, my lord. They do not deserve to be here. I hate them too, just as much or more than you do. I would kill this Nazgul right here. But orders are orders. And they were direct from the great king. It's the last time you disappoint me, Paulanna. My lord. Gather your things. You will immediately depart for the Mines of Shadows. Although Paulanna knew full well that it was the fate that awaited her. It was what Inrich had been looking for since his return, but it did not cease to cause him great sadness because he was expected. The Mines of Shadows? She exclaimed, annoyed. Agnoruk did not know it, but the Shadow Mines were mines located to the east of the kingdom. Inside they had been fighting against the Stufos for centuries. Few elves wanted to fight in the mines, but the underground war continued for two main reasons. The minerals that were extracted were essential to the kingdom, and as a matter of pride, the king did not want to suffer a defeat by the Stufos in Bordalania itself and be on the same level as the dwarfs of the hills or the dark elves. Paulanna had already heard news of Ziranaka's recent victory, so the situation inside the mines must have been too delicate to send the great king's favorite. But despite the recent victory, going to the mines was certain death. Whoever was destined for the Mines of the Shadows did not return. The war in the mines was also useful to the great king to control his subjects, since in that place he could effectively get rid of those elements opposed to his rule or send the fallen in disgrace inside the court to be forgotten forever. Few foreigners had knowledge of what was really happening in the mines. It was a closely guarded secret so as not to show a sign of weakness to the rest of the kingdoms. But the half-orc, seeing Paulanna's terrified reaction to the prince's order, imagined that the mines must be a very murky fate. Strangely, he had compassion for Paulanna. Can I make a proposal? The elves were surprised at Agnoruk's words. The king's son looked down on Agnoruk. Paulanna became much angrier. What she lacked. Now the orc gloated over his misfortune. Tell me. Inrich was strangely dialoguing with Agnoruk despite the contempt he had for him. I have a punishment far worse than the shadow mines for your knight. The elf prince looked intrigued at Agnoruk, who made his proposal. Order her to be my squire for 30 years. The idea left them all surprised. Paulanna was in shock just like the prince, who at first did not seem to understand the half-orc's proposal. What do you say? What more dishonor for an elf knight than to be relegated to being the squire of an orc? It's such a great contempt that I doubt I'll ever re-enter this realm. Prince Inrich began to find the idea funny. He had already assigned the rest of the members of the table to the mines first thing in the morning. But deep down he was afraid of Paulanna. She was a brave warrior and had already survived certain death many times. If anyone could survive the mines, it was her. The idea of the half-orc was magnificent, much better than dying. When she was demoted to squire, she would be despised by all. He smiled satisfied. For an Nazgul, you're pretty smart. It's a good punishment, so be it. Paulanna, from now on you will be at the service of this Nazgul. Paulanna went white. This was much worse. She already had problems because of her human ancestry, and now this. No one would talk to her in the kingdom, ever. No. Do you prefer the shadow mines? If I prefer them, send me there. It's a more honorable fate at least. Paulanna pleaded with Inrich, who had certainly achieved much more than expected and showed no mercy to the elf warrior. For you will be the squire of this half-orc for your next 40 years. It's your destiny. Accept it. In Inrich's words, there was only hatred for her and a certain tone of joy. He had finished with Paulanna forever. The prince disappeared and Paulanna was devastated. He had saved his life in exchange for suffering Adishana for eternity. Paulanna sat on the floor to cry. She had disappointed her entire lineage, banished from Bordalania forever. Agnoruk did not understand the reason for so much drama. The elf remained motionless for a long time, and seeing that Paulanna did not react, the half-orc placed a piece of dung on her head. Come on, Paulanna, we have to fill this car with shit. Paulanna looked at the half-orc with hatred. With dignity she removed the piece of excrement from his head and threw it into the wagon, then got up to finish the punishment as soon as possible.